The heavy weight of his hand slammed her against the cold marble wall of the courthouse hallway. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her shoulder, but it was nothing compared to the searing humiliation boiling inside her chest. The conversations around them died down. The people who had been walking past just moments ago stopped in their tracks, their eyes darting toward the commotion. But no one moved. No one interfered. The authority in his uniform paralyzed them all. His face was twisted in a smug grin, his voice dripping with condescension as he leaned in close, his breath hot against her skin. "You people," he sneered, tightening his grip on her arm, "think you can walk in here like you own the place? Like you're somebody. But let me make something very clear, you're nothing. Just another loud-mouthed nobody who doesn't know when to keep her head down." His eyes scanned her, filled with the kind of arrogance that comes from knowing the system would always be on his side. He knew the power he had. And he was using every ounce of it to remind her exactly where he thought she belonged. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but her face remained unreadable. The humiliation burned, but she swallowed it down. Not here. Not now. Behind them, a low murmur rippled through the crowd gathering at the entrance of the courtroom. Lawyers, clerks, and bystanders exchanged nervous glances. They had seen this officer before. His reputation wasn't a secret. His temper, his prejudice, his unchecked power, it was all known, whispered about, tolerated. But no one had ever dared to stand in his way. And right now, he looked completely untouchable. "You think you can just walk in here, making a scene, wasting my time?" His voice grew louder, bolder, feeding off the silence around them. "I should drag your ass out of here myself. Hell, maybe I should throw you in a cell for the night. Teach you a little respect." A hush fell over the hallway. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. She remained still. She didn't fight back. She didn't push him away. She didn't need to. Not yet. His grip on her tightened once more before he finally released her with a sharp shove, sending her stumbling a step back. He chuckled, shaking his head as if the very sight of her disgusted him. Then, turning to the small crowd that had gathered, he smirked. "What? You all waiting for a damn invitation? Show's over." One by one, people turned away. Some out of fear. Some out of habit. Others simply unwilling to get involved. He exhaled sharply, as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than an inconvenience to his day, and adjusted his badge. "That's what I thought." She straightened her shoulders, slowly brushing off the sleeves of her blazer as if wiping away his touch. Then, for the first time since the assault, she spoke. "You done?" Her voice was calm. Steady. A stark contrast to the boiling rage that burned beneath it. The officer scoffed, amused by her composure. "Yeah, I'm done. You're lucky I don't haul your ass out of here right now." A pause. A single beat of silence. Then she smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a defeated one. A knowing smile. One that sent an unshakable chill up his spine. "Good," she said smoothly. "Because in about 5 minutes, you're going to wish you never put your hands on me." His smirk faltered. Just slightly. But he recovered quickly, rolling his eyes. "Yeah. And why's that?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the courtroom doors as they finally swung open. Inside, the judge was already seated. Prosecutors, attorneys, and law enforcement officers lined the room. The air crackled with anticipation. The officer let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he crossed his arms over his chest. "Whatever, lady. You really think anyone in there gives a damn about you?" She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge the words. Instead, she stepped forward. Confident. Unshaken. Every step fueled by something far more powerful than anger. Justice. And then, just before stepping inside, she turned back to face him one last time. "Watch closely, officer," she murmured. "Because I promise you, this is a day you'll never forget." And as she disappeared into the courtroom, the weight of her words settled deep in his chest. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty flashed in his eyes. Because what he didn't know, what no one in that room had any way of knowing, was that in just a few minutes, his entire world was about to come crashing down. And when the truth was finally revealed, when the gavel struck and the weight of his actions came full circle, what happened next would leave everyone in that courtroom speechless. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to make something clear. Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism in all its forms. No one should ever have to face discrimination, injustice, or hate because of the color of their skin. To our black viewers, we see you. We support you. We stand with you. This channel is a place for powerful stories, and today's tale is one of justice, karma, and standing tall in the face of prejudice. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The courthouse in Atlanta was a place of contrasts. Inside its heavy wooden doors, justice was supposed to be blind, but everyone knew that was a lie. The marble floors gleamed under the bright overhead lights, polished daily as if the cleanliness of the building could wash away the corruption that seeped through its walls. Lawyers in expensive suits strode confidently through the halls, their shoes clicking against the floor, their voices filled with the kind of arrogance that came from knowing the system worked for them. Defendants sat hunched on benches, some whispering to their public defenders, others staring blankly ahead, already knowing the outcome of their trials before they even began. And the police? They walked these halls like they owned them. Officer Brad Calloway was one of them. A veteran of the force, he had spent over a decade patrolling the streets, climbing the ranks just enough to wield power but never enough to be watched too closely. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed and spotless, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To the outside world, he was a decorated officer, respected by his peers. To those who knew better, he was a different kind of authority, a man who wore his power like armor, using it not to protect but to control. Brad had grown up in a world where men like him didn't have to answer to anyone. His father had been a cop before him, his grandfather before that. They had built their lives on the belief that authority was meant to be unquestioned, that respect was demanded, not earned. He carried those lessons with him into every interaction, every arrest, every moment he spent in uniform. And in a place like this courthouse, where people like him were the rule and not the exception, he had no reason to believe that would ever change. On the other side of the courtroom, across the very hall where he had just shoved a woman against the wall and humiliated her in front of dozens of witnesses, sat a group of police officers waiting for the next case to be called. They laughed, checked their phones, exchanged casual banter. To them, this was just another day. If they had seen what happened, they didn't care. And if they had heard what Brad had said, none of them would ever question it. That was how things worked. But Brad wasn't just any cop. He was the kind that men like him protected, not because they admired him, but because they knew he could just as easily be them. He had complaints on his record, excessive force, racial profiling, misconduct reports that never seemed to go anywhere. Each time, he had walked away without so much as a slap on the wrist. He knew how to play the game. He knew how to say just enough but never too much, how to twist the narrative until the story was always in his favor. And he knew, without a doubt, that no one would ever question him over something as small as roughing up a black woman in a courthouse. That woman, Camille Harris, stood just a few feet away now, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer as if she hadn't just been manhandled in front of half the courthouse. She was tall, poised, her expression unreadable, her movements controlled. She had spent years perfecting that restraint, swallowing the anger that burned in her gut every time she encountered men like Brad Calloway. She had learned long ago that emotion was a weapon they would use against her, that raising her voice would turn her into the problem rather than the victim. Camille had seen men like him her whole life. She had grown up watching her father, a respected attorney, battle men just like Brad in courtrooms just like this one. She had seen the way they smirked and they got away with things that would ruin anyone else's life, the way they laughed when the system protected them time and time again. She had known, even as a child, that the scales of justice were never balanced. But that had never stopped her from stepping into this world, from choosing to fight back in the only way she knew how. She had spent years working her way up, proving herself in rooms filled with men who doubted her, earning respect in places where she was never meant to belong. And now, here she was, standing in the very courtroom where justice was supposed to be served, with a racist cop's handprint still burning on her arm. Brad hadn't even looked at her since their encounter. He had gone back to his usual routine, scrolling through his phone, chatting with another officer, acting as if nothing had happened. Because to him, it was nothing. A moment of amusement in an otherwise unremarkable day. He had done it before. He would do it again. But Camille knew something he didn't. She knew that his arrogance, his unchecked power, his belief that he was untouchable, those things were about to come crashing down around him. She knew that in just a few minutes, when the judge entered that courtroom and the next case was called, Brad Calloway's world would be turned upside down. Because the woman he had just shoved against a wall. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the new chief of police. And today, justice wasn't going to be blind. It was going to have a face. And it was going to watch him fall. The moment Camille stepped into the courtroom, the air shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of change that made people sit up straighter, that pulled attention toward a presence even before words were spoken. The judge, already seated behind the towering mahogany bench, glanced in her direction with an unreadable expression. The attorneys, some flipping through files, others murmuring among themselves, instinctively quieted. Even the officers lining the walls, men in crisp uniforms, men just like Brad, fell silent. Something about her presence demanded it. Brad Calloway, however, remained oblivious. He leaned against the far wall near the jury box, arms crossed, exuding the same lazy arrogance he carried everywhere. His eyes flickered toward Camille only briefly before returning to his phone, thumbs tapping across the screen as if she was nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience. He was comfortable. Unbothered. And why wouldn't he be? The system had always protected men like him. Camille took her seat at the prosecution's table, her expression steady, betraying nothing. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he shuffled through paperwork. A sharp rap of the gavel silenced the remaining whispers in the room. Next case, he announced. State of Georgia versus Officer Bradley Calloway. Silence. Then, confusion. A flicker of movement, Brad's head snapping up, his posture stiffening as his name echoed through the courtroom. His brows furrowed, lips parting as if he hadn't heard correctly. Camille didn't look at him. Not yet. The prosecutor, a tall, sharp-eyed man in a navy suit, rose to his feet and approached the bench. Your Honor, as outlined in the motion filed earlier this week, the prosecution has gathered substantial evidence regarding Officer Calloway's conduct while in uniform, including but not limited to excessive use of force, intimidation tactics, and the falsification of reports to justify unlawful detainments. These allegations, corroborated by multiple sources, warrant immediate legal proceedings. The weight of those words crashed down like a tidal wave, sucking the air out of the room. Murmurs erupted from the crowd. A few gasps. A ripple of disbelief. Brad's mouth opened, then shut, then opened again. What the hell is this? His voice was sharp, a mixture of anger and confusion as he looked around, seeking confirmation that this was some kind of joke. But no one was laughing. Camille finally turned her head, locking eyes with him for the first time since their encounter in the hallway. She saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, the way his shoulders tensed. He was still trying to piece it together, still holding on to the belief that whatever was happening, it wasn't real. That whatever this was, he would walk away from it, untouched, just like he always had. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Officer Calloway, you will refrain from speaking until addressed directly by this court." His voice was firm, cutting through the mounting tension. "The allegations brought against you are serious, and this hearing will determine the necessary legal course moving forward." Brad let out a sharp breath, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. He turned toward the defense attorney assigned to him, a man he barely knew, a man who was now flipping through papers with an expression that suggested he had been briefed on this long before Brad himself had. His voice lowered, words directed toward the attorney. "What the hell is going on? They can't do this." The attorney exhaled, glancing at him sideways. "They can. And they are." The murmurs in the courtroom continued, a slow-building storm of speculation and disbelief. Camille remained still, watching, waiting. The judge motioned for the prosecution to continue. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Your Honor, if I may, we would like to introduce a key witness who can provide crucial testimony regarding Officer Calloway's actions within this very courthouse earlier today." Brad's head snapped toward the prosecutor, then back toward the judge. His pulse was a drum against his ribs. "You've got to be kidding me." "Quiet," the judge warned. Camille rose to her feet. For a fraction of a second, Brad's eyes widened. And then, just as quickly, he masked it with anger. His jaw clenched. The prosecutor gestured toward her. "Chief Camille Harris, would you please state your name and title for the record?" A ripple of realization swept through the room. Chief. Not just another citizen. Not just a passerby. Brad's world tilted on its axis. She stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "Camille Harris. Chief of Police, Atlanta Police Department." The courtroom was dead silent. Brad's stomach twisted. A cold weight settled in his chest, the kind that only came when the ground beneath you cracked, and you realized there was nothing to hold on to. Chief of Police. The words echoed in his head, sharp and relentless. The woman he had shoved against the wall. The woman he had humiliated in front of half the courthouse. The woman he had threatened with arrest just because he could. She wasn't just someone passing through. She was his superior. And she was about to bury him alive. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "This is bullshit." His voice was lower now, less sure. She can," the prosecutor interrupted. "And she will." Brad's pulse hammered as he looked around the room, searching for something, someone, to stop this. His fellow officers, the ones who had laughed at his jokes, who had always backed him up, sat frozen in their seats, their gazes locked on the unfolding scene, but none of them moved to help him. He had always thought the system would protect him. That he was untouchable. But as Camille Harris stood before the courtroom, her stance unyielding, her presence commanding, he realized, for the first time in his life, he had no power here. And whatever was coming next, it was going to destroy him. The weight of silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Camille stood firm, her presence undeniable, her title now a force that reshaped the entire atmosphere of the room. She had seen it in their eyes, the shift, the realization, the slow crumble of Brad Calloway's confidence. The moment she had uttered those words, Chief of Police, his world had fractured. But this wasn't just about him. This was about something much bigger, something that had festered for far too long within these walls. And today, justice would finally have a voice. Brad's breathing had changed. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven movements, his fingers curling at his sides, gripping at control he no longer had. His mind was racing, scrambling for a way out. A loophole. An excuse. Anything. He wasn't supposed to be in this position. He had spent his entire career making sure this never happened. His voice came out lower than before, a strained attempt at regaining footing. This is a setup. You can't just, he turned sharply toward his attorney, who was already flipping through papers, face impassive, clearly prepared for this before Brad himself had even stepped into the room. The betrayal of it stung. Camille's voice cut through the tension like a blade. I can. And I did. The judge leaned forward, gaze steady. Officer Calloway, this is an official legal proceeding. You will speak only when addressed. Do you understand? Brad swallowed, his throat dry, the words sticking like tar. Yes, Your Honor. Camille shifted slightly, her gaze locking onto him with an intensity that stripped away whatever illusion of authority he still thought he had. You assumed no one would question you. That no one would push back. You've operated under that belief your entire career, haven't you, Officer Calloway? Brad scoffed, shaking his head, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. This is ridiculous. I did my job. I did what I had to do. Camille arched a brow, her voice calm but unyielding. Is that what you call it? Intimidation? Racial profiling? Physical aggression against unarmed civilians? A ripple of tension moved through the room, the weight of her words hanging between them like an axe waiting to fall. Brad's jaw tightened. I don't have to listen to this. You do, the judge interrupted, his voice sharp. Or you can be held in contempt. Brad hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. He had no allies here. He could feel it, the quiet distance growing between himself and the people who, not too long ago, would have shielded him. His fellow officers no longer looked at him with confidence. Some wouldn't even meet his gaze. The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice measured. Your Honor, we'd like to present documented evidence of Officer Calloway's repeated misconduct, compiled over the course of several years. This includes body cam footage, witness statements, and formal complaints that, up until now, had been disregarded due to internal protectionism within the department. He paused, letting the words settle before glancing at Camille. With Chief Harris's authorization, those barriers have been removed. Every single infraction will now be subject to review. Brad exhaled sharply, shaking his head, his voice tinged with something dangerously close to desperation. This is a witch hunt. That's all this is. Just another way to make an example out of a cop for doing his damn job. Camille leaned forward slightly, her gaze sharp. Your job. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the courtroom with an undeniable weight. Brad's fingers twitched. He was unraveling, and he knew it. Yeah. My job. Camille tilted her head. Was it your job when you falsified police reports? When you used unnecessary force on civilians who posed no threat? When you used your badge as a weapon instead of a shield? His mouth opened, then closed, his defenses cracking under the weight of exposure. The prosecutor didn't miss the hesitation. Your Honor, if permitted, we'd like to play a key piece of evidence. Footage taken from courthouse security cameras, unedited, time-stamped, and indisputable. Brad's stomach twisted. He knew what was coming before it even began. The judge nodded. Proceed. A moment later, the screen flickered to life. And there it was. The hallway. The polished floors. The gathering of bystanders frozen in place. And in the center of it all, him. The footage played in agonizing detail. The way he had grabbed Camille, the force with which he had slammed her against the wall, the sneer on his face, the way his mouth moved, forming words that, at the time, had meant nothing to him. You people think you can walk in here like you own the place. Like you're somebody. But let me make something very clear, you're nothing. The room was silent. Brad could feel every gaze locked onto him. The shame burned beneath his skin, but he lifted his chin, forcing defiance into his expression. That doesn't prove anything. The prosecutor didn't flinch. Doesn't it? The footage ended. The silence stretched. Camille inhaled slowly before speaking, her voice steady. You never even asked me who I was. You just assumed. Because to you, it didn't matter. To you, I was just another black woman who didn't belong in your space. Brad's hands curled into fists. Camille's expression didn't waver. But this isn't your space, Officer Calloway. Not anymore. The prosecutor stepped forward again. Your Honor, in light of the overwhelming evidence, we move to suspend Officer Calloway's position immediately, pending further investigation and legal review. Brad surged forward instinctively. You can't do that. The gavel slammed down. The judge's voice rang through the room, final and unwavering. You are hereby stripped of your badge and placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. You will surrender your firearm and department-issued equipment before leaving this courtroom. Additionally, a formal investigation into your conduct will proceed, and if necessary, criminal charges will follow. The words hit him like a freight train. Stripped. Suspended. Investigated. He turned wildly, looking for someone, anyone, to step in, to defend him, to say this was all some mistake. But no one moved. And then Camille spoke again, the final nail in his coffin. You wanted to teach me a lesson, didn't you? Brad's throat worked, but no words came. She gave him a small, knowing nod. Consider it learned. The courtroom doors swung open. 2 officers stepped forward. And for the first time in his life, Brad Calloway felt the crushing weight of justice, not as the one wielding it, but as the one beneath it. Brad Calloway felt the world closing in around him, the walls of the courtroom pressing in with suffocating intensity. His body tensed, muscles rigid as if trying to resist the reality crashing down on him. He had walked into this building as a man who believed himself untouchable, a man who had spent years wielding power without consequence, a man who had never once questioned whether the system would protect him. And now? Now he was standing on the other side of that same system, the weight of accountability pressing down on him in a way he had never imagined possible. His mind raced, scrambling for an escape, for something, anything, that could reverse what was happening. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. He had spent years ensuring that moments like this never came for men like him. His voice, once so full of authority, cracked under the pressure as he fought to form words. You can't do this, he said, the desperation bleeding into his tone. This isn't right. This is a setup. Camille Harris remained where she stood, her presence unshaken, her face unreadable. She had been in this position before, had seen this exact moment play out with other men like him, men who had abused their power, men who had believed they were invincible, men who only began to understand accountability when it was staring them in the face. She tilted her head slightly, her voice steady and deliberate. A setup, she repeated, her tone laced with something cold and sharp. Tell me, Officer Calloway, what part of this was a setup? Was it the footage? The dozens of witness statements? The years of misconduct reports that have been swept under the rug to protect you? Or was it when you shoved me against a wall and told me I was nothing? Brad's lips parted, but no words came out. Camille took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them, her gaze locked onto his with unwavering intensity. You want to talk about what's right? About what's fair? Her voice, though controlled, carried an unmistakable weight of restrained fury. Tell me, Officer Calloway, did you stop to consider fairness when you used your badge to intimidate innocent people? When you falsified reports to justify your actions? When you humiliated, belittled, and brutalized those who didn't have the power to fight back? Brad clenched his jaw so tightly that the muscles in his face twitched. His hands balled into fists at his sides, but there was nothing he could do. He had no authority here. He had no power left to wield. His breath was shaky when he finally spoke. This is bullshit, he muttered under his breath, though the conviction in his voice was weak, like a man grasping at something that no longer existed. Camille let out a soft, humorless laugh. shaking her head. "No, Officer Calloway," she said. "This is justice." The room remained still, every person present acutely aware of the shift in power, the irreversible change that had taken place. No one spoke. No one moved. The judge leaned forward, his expression void of sympathy. "Officer Calloway, as per the evidence presented and the overwhelming testimony against you, this court finds just cause for your immediate suspension. Effective immediately, you will surrender your badge, your firearm, and all departmental-issued equipment pending a full investigation." Brad's heart slammed against his ribs, his entire body rigid as the words settled over him like a death sentence. "No, no, wait," he said, his voice cracking, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone to intervene. This can't happen. This isn't fair." Camille remained silent, her expression steady. The judge's voice cut through the air once more. "2 officers will escort you from this building, where you will be placed on administrative leave without pay. Should the investigation result in formal charges, you will be expected to comply with all legal proceedings accordingly." Brad turned to his attorney, his voice lowering to a frantic whisper. "Do something," he hissed. "Tell them they can't do this." But the attorney, a man who had once been more than willing to bend rules in his favor, simply sighed, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt as he shook his head. "There's nothing I can do, Calloway," he said. "Not anymore." Brad felt his stomach drop. He turned, eyes wild, searching the faces of the other officers in the room. His brothers in uniform. The same men who had laughed at his jokes, who had backed him up on countless calls, who had always been there to reinforce the shield that protected them all. But now they wouldn't even look at him. Some kept their gazes locked on the floor. Others stared blankly ahead, unwilling to make eye contact. No one spoke. No one defended him. It was in that moment that Brad understood, he was alone. His voice came out hoarse, thick with disbelief. "You're just gonna let this happen?" His eyes darted between the officers, desperation creeping into his expression. "All these years, all the things we've done together, all the things we've covered for each other, and now you're just gonna sit there and let them do this to me?" The silence that followed was louder than any answer they could have given. Camille stepped closer, her voice quiet but cutting. "You thought they'd protect you, didn't you?" She tilted her head slightly. "The way the system always has. The way you've relied on it to cover for you. To bury the truth." Brad's breath hitched. "But here's the thing about power," Camille continued, her voice like steel. "It's only as strong as the people willing to uphold it. And today—" She let the word settle. "No one's willing to protect you anymore." Brad's entire body locked up, panic seeping into every corner of his being. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had always been the one on the other side of this equation. He had been the one making the rules. He had been the one deciding who walked free and who didn't. And now the rules had turned against him. He turned back to Camille, something desperate in his gaze. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this." Camille regarded him carefully, as if weighing the words. For the briefest of moments, silence stretched between them. Then she spoke. "You didn't have to do it either," she said, her voice quiet. "But you did." And with that, she turned to the officers waiting by the door. "Take him out." Brad's breath left him in a shuddering exhale, his shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of the moment. And then, just like that, the man who had spent his career wielding unchecked power was led out of the courtroom, his footsteps heavy, his head low, stripped of the authority he had once used to destroy so many lives. For the first time in his life, Brad Calloway understood what it felt like to have the world turn its back on him. And Camille Harris? She didn't watch him go. She had already moved forward. The courtroom still pulsed with the weight of what had just transpired, as if the walls themselves were struggling to process the irreversible shift that had taken place. Even with Brad Calloway gone, escorted out under the watchful eyes of those who had once stood beside him, the echoes of his downfall still reverberated through the chamber. The tension hung thick in the air, stretching between the remaining officers, the legal teams, the spectators who had just witnessed what so many had once believed impossible. Camille Harris remained standing for a long moment, unmoving, absorbing the stillness that followed the storm. Her breath was steady, her heartbeat even, but she could feel the unspoken thoughts surrounding her, feel the gaze of those who were recalibrating their understanding of the world in real time. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on every single person in that room. The expressions in the gallery ranged from silent satisfaction to lingering disbelief. Some exchanged hushed whispers, their voices carrying the undeniable charge of witnessing history unfold before them. Others simply sat in stunned quiet, processing the magnitude of what they had just seen. Because this wasn't just about Brad Calloway. This was about what he had represented. What he had symbolized. What had been tolerated, permitted, protected for far too long. And now, the question remained, what came next? Camille exhaled, her shoulders squaring, her mind already shifting to the inevitabilities that would follow. This wasn't over. The act of holding one man accountable had never been the end goal. There were layers upon layers to dismantle, rot buried so deeply within the foundation of the system that one case, one man, was only the beginning. She turned, her steps deliberate as she made her way toward the exit. The hush followed her, the sound of movement, of shuffled papers and murmured words, seeming almost secondary to the presence she carried with her. Outside the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, the courthouse halls were a sea of movement. Officers stood in small clusters, talking in low voices, their expressions carefully schooled into something unreadable. Some barely acknowledged her presence as she passed. Others watched her with an emotion she could not quite name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. A slow understanding that the ground beneath them was no longer as solid as they had once believed. Camille didn't pause, didn't give them the satisfaction of looking for their approval, their reactions. She moved with purpose, each step firm against the polished tile, each second bringing her closer to the reality waiting beyond the courthouse doors. The world outside was already waiting. The moment she stepped onto the courthouse steps, the energy shifted. The hum of the city, the ever-present movement of life in Atlanta, was now punctuated by the chaos of the press. Reporters. Cameras. Microphones. Protesters. Onlookers who had only caught whispers of what had transpired inside but had been drawn here nonetheless, waiting for something, confirmation, closure, answers. Flashes burst through the air. The voices rose, overlapping in a wave of demands, questions, accusations, curiosity. Chief Harris, do you have a statement on the court's decision? What does this mean for the department moving forward? Was this a personal vendetta? Will additional officers be investigated? She could feel the pressure building, the expectation hanging over her. The weight of their eyes, their cameras, the knowledge that whatever she said next would be analyzed, dissected, turned into headlines. But Camille didn't stop. She descended the courthouse steps, her expression unreadable, her silence a statement in itself. Justice had already spoken. And now, it was time to see if the world was ready to listen. She moved with certainty, cutting through the crowd, stepping past the demands for an explanation. There was no need to justify what had happened in that courtroom. The evidence had done that. The truth had done that. She reached her car, her fingers wrapping around the handle just as her phone vibrated in her pocket. A glance at the screen. The mayor's office. She sighed. Of course. Sliding into the driver's seat, she answered, keeping her voice even, prepared for whatever political fallout awaited on the other end. This is Harris. A pause. Then the measured voice of the mayor's chief of staff. Chief, we need to talk. Camille closed her eyes for a brief moment, exhaling slowly before gripping the steering wheel. She had expected this. She had expected all of it. Dismantling a system didn't happen in a single day, in a single courtroom, with a single case. The battle was bigger than Brad Calloway. And Camille Harris was just getting started. The air inside the car felt thick, heavy with everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. Camille gripped the steering wheel with one hand, phone pressed to her ear with the other, her gaze fixed on the movement outside the windshield. The reporters were still there, some lingering near the steps of the courthouse, others scattered along the sidewalk, cameras poised, waiting, always waiting. They wanted a statement. A reaction. Something they could package and broadcast, something they could twist into a narrative that suited them. But Camille had learned long ago that silence could be just as powerful as words, if not more so. The voice on the other end of the line remained composed, but there was a tension buried beneath the surface, a carefully measured restraint that told her everything she needed to know before a single explanation was given. Chief Harris, the mayor's chief of staff began, a carefully placed pause stretching between them, as if the right words could somehow soften what was coming next. I assume you understand the implications of today's events. Camille let out a slow breath, fingers tapping lightly against the leather of the steering wheel. I assume you understand that the implications were inevitable. A pause. Then a quiet exhale, the kind that only came when someone realized they were speaking to a person who would not be easily swayed. Camille, the voice softened, shifting from formality to something closer to familiarity, though it was still laced with controlled diplomacy. This case, this decision, it's already causing waves. The department is tense. The union is furious. The press is eating it up. There are officers who, another pause, another carefully chosen moment of hesitation, who feel this sets a dangerous precedent. Camille's jaw tightened. You mean accountability? A sigh. You know exactly what I mean. She did. Of course, she did. She had spent her entire career navigating the delicate balance of power, had spent years understanding the politics of policing, the unspoken rules, the invisible lines drawn to protect the institution at all costs. But she had never been one to play along, never been one to bow to the pressures of preservation when it came at the expense of justice. Her voice was calm when she spoke, but there was an edge to it, sharp and deliberate. Let me ask you something. How many times have we sat in meetings discussing officers like Calloway? How many times have we seen reports of misconduct, watched body cam footage of unnecessary force, heard first-hand accounts from victims, only to be told that our hands were tied? How many times have we let men like him walk away without consequences because it was easier than facing the pushback? The silence on the other end was answer enough. She continued. We don't get to complain about broken trust in the community when we are the ones breaking it. We don't get to talk about integrity if we refuse to uphold it. And we sure as hell don't get to call ourselves protectors of justice if we only enforce it when it's convenient. The voice on the other end shifted, something in the tone becoming quieter, heavier. You know there will be fallout. Camille let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. There's always fallout when people who aren't used to consequences finally face them. A deeper sigh this time, one that carried the weight of an impossible situation. The mayor is getting calls. The commissioner is getting pressure from the union. The department is split. Some officers are saying this was overdue. Others are saying you're setting fire to the system from the inside. Camille closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself the briefest second of stillness before responding. Good. That means they're finally paying attention. Another pause. This one stretched longer than the others, filled with the kind of silence that only happened when people were considering something they weren't sure they wanted to admit. Then, finally, the mayor wants to meet. Tonight. Camille opened her eyes, exhaling slowly. I'll be there. The call ended. She dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, staring at it for a moment before shaking her head slightly. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. She reached for the door handle, stepping out into the cool evening air. The murmurs from the reporters spiked the moment they saw her, microphones lifted, cameras shifting in her direction. She ignored them, moving toward the car parked 2 spaces down where a familiar figure leaned against the hood, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Detective Marcus Reed. She had known him for years, had worked cases with him back when she was still just a beat cop, had shared long nights of frustration over the very system they were both entrenched in. He was one of the few people she trusted completely, one of the few who had never wavered in his integrity, even when it would have been easier to do so. He didn't say anything as she approached, simply studied her with the kind of scrutiny that only came from knowing someone well enough to see the things they didn't say out loud. She stopped a few feet away, lifting an eyebrow. "If you're here to tell me I just kicked a hornet's nest, you're about 3 steps too late." Marcus let out a breath, shaking his head. "Nah. That nest was already on fire. You just made sure everyone saw the flames." A small smirk ghosted over her lips, but it was fleeting. "And now?" His expression sobered slightly. "And now people are picking sides." Camille studied him for a moment. "Which side are you on?" He didn't hesitate. "The same one I've always been on." That was why she had come to trust him. She leaned against the car beside him, crossing her arms. "It's only going to get worse from here." Marcus nodded. "Yeah. And the people who've spent their whole lives believing they'll never have to answer for anything? They're scared now. That makes them dangerous." She let out a slow breath, watching as the city moved around them. Cars passing. Pedestrians going about their lives, unaware of the undercurrents shifting beneath the surface. "Let them be scared," she said finally. "It's about damn time." Marcus huffed out a quiet laugh. "Well, Chief, you sure know how to make an entrance." She smirked slightly. "Then they're really gonna hate what happens next." The night stretched ahead of them, uncertain, unpredictable, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The tension in the city was palpable. The moment news of Brad Calloway's suspension hit the media, the streets buzzed with speculation, outrage, and approval in equal measure. The divide was clear. Those who had long demanded accountability saw it as a long overdue victory, proof that power could finally be checked, that justice wasn't just a word used to pacify the masses. But there were others, officers, officials, men like Calloway's allies, who saw it as a betrayal. A warning shot. A signal that their way of life was under attack. And the thing about men who had spent their entire lives believing they were above consequences, they didn't take well to losing control. Camille knew this wasn't over. The courtroom had been just the beginning. The real fight was unfolding now, behind closed doors, in quiet conversations held in smoke-filled back rooms, in hastily arranged meetings where people with power whispered about what should be done about her. About the problem she had become. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since she left the courthouse. Calls from reporters, community leaders, angry union representatives, and even a few anonymous threats left on voicemail. She ignored most of them. She had expected the backlash. She had prepared for it. What she hadn't prepared for, however, was the conversation she was about to have. She arrived at the mayor's office just as the sky turned a deep shade of indigo, the city lights flickering on as if preparing for the chaos that would undoubtedly spill into the next day. The security at the entrance barely looked at her, their expressions carefully neutral, their silence speaking volumes. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. She could feel it the moment she stepped into the conference room. The mayor sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled together as he listened to the man beside him, Commissioner Edward Langley, a man who had spent decades molding the Atlanta Police Department into what it was today. A man who did not like losing. Langley's eyes flickered to Camille the second she stepped inside, his expression cool, but there was something beneath it, something sharp and assessing. He was a man who had built his career on knowing which battles to fight and which to avoid. And right now, he was calculating whether Camille Harris was a battle he could win. The mayor gestured toward a seat across from them. "Chief Harris, thank you for coming." Camille sat without hesitation, leveling her gaze with his. "You didn't give me much of a choice." The mayor let out a tired sigh. "You know why we're here." She folded her hands on the table, waiting. Langley leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. "What happened today was unprecedented." She arched an eyebrow. "Justice tends to be." His jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his tone even. "You've made a lot of enemies today." Camille tilted her head. "And how many of them deserve to be called that?" The mayor rubbed his temples, exhaling. "The department is in chaos. Officers are divided. The union is threatening a mass walkout. The public is demanding more. The governor's office is watching this closely, and I don't need to tell you how much pressure is coming from D.C. Camille remained unmoved. "Then maybe it's time they all start asking themselves why accountability feels like an attack." Langley's eyes darkened. "You think you can just waltz in and change everything overnight? You think stripping Calloway of his badge solves anything?" Camille met his gaze, unflinching. "No. But it's a start." The room fell into a heavy silence. Langley's fingers drummed against the table before he spoke again, his voice lower now, more pointed. "You're making a lot of powerful people very uncomfortable, Harris." Camille leaned forward, mirroring his intensity. "Good." Langley exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "You think this is about justice. But this is politics. You just set a precedent that people like Calloway can actually fall. Do you have any idea what that means?" She held his gaze. "It means they should be scared." The mayor leaned back in his chair, watching the exchange carefully, as if trying to gauge just how far this was going to go. Langley's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're playing a dangerous game." Camille smirked, but there was no amusement in it. "No, Commissioner. I'm finally playing fair." Langley stood suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. He adjusted his tie, straightening his posture. "The department needs stability, Chief. It needs leadership. And it needs someone who understands the weight of what's at stake." Camille rose to her feet as well. "Then maybe it's time we redefine what leadership looks like." Langley's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to the mayor, his expression carefully composed. "We'll discuss this further in private." The mayor nodded but said nothing else. Camille didn't wait for permission to leave. She turned on her heel and walked out, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors of City Hall. The city was watching. The department was watching. And the battle was only just beginning. The days that followed were relentless. The city was a battlefield of words, protests, and whispered threats. The police union raged, their voices loud in the media, calling Camille Harris a disgrace, a traitor, an enemy of the very institution she was meant to lead. But for every officer who turned their back, there were others, ones who had long remained silent, afraid of the repercussions, who now stepped forward, their voices rising in support. The weight of truth had shattered the illusion of unity within the department, exposing the fractures that had been there all along. Camille had expected the resistance. She had anticipated the backlash. But she had also known something that men like Commissioner Langley and Brad Calloway had refused to believe: when you give people a glimpse of justice, when you remind them that the system is supposed to work for them and not just against them, they do not forget. The people of Atlanta were watching, and they were no longer willing to accept silence as an answer. Brad Calloway's fall was not just a headline, it was a warning. His termination became official within the week, his name erased from the force he had once controlled with unchecked arrogance. But his consequences didn't end there. Investigations into his past cases uncovered a pattern of falsified reports, excessive force, and corruption that had been buried for years under layers of departmental protection. His legal troubles were only just beginning. His attorneys scrambled, his former allies distanced themselves, and the man who had once walked these halls with an air of invincibility now found himself completely alone. The most poetic part of his downfall came not in the courtroom, but in the quiet moments after, when he realized that power had never been truly his, it had only been borrowed, sustained by the people who had chosen to look away. And now? Now they weren't looking away anymore. Commissioner Langley did everything he could to keep the department from crumbling under the weight of exposure. He worked behind the scenes, pulling strings, calling in favors, trying to stall the reforms Camille was putting into place. But power built on corruption is fragile, and his influence was no exception. The city council called for an independent review of the entire department, something Langley had spent years avoiding. The mayor, once hesitant to challenge the institution, now had no choice but to demand change. Langley's desperation became visible in the way he fought against it, but it was a losing battle. By the time the review was complete, it was clear, he had spent decades protecting the wrong men, enabling the wrong culture, and covering up the wrong crimes. His forced resignation was quiet, devoid of the grandeur he had once commanded. He left the city in disgrace, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. And Camille? Camille didn't just survive. She thrived. Her position had never been about personal revenge, despite what the media and her detractors tried to claim. She didn't take the job to be liked, and she sure as hell didn't take it to maintain the status quo. She was there to do what no one before her had dared to do, change the system from within. It was slow. It was exhausting. It was met with resistance at every turn. But little by little, it was working. For every officer who resigned in protest, new recruits entered the force, trained under a leadership that no longer turned a blind eye to injustice. For every policy that had once protected men like Calloway, new accountability measures were put in place. For every voice that called her a disgrace, there were thousands more that called her exactly what she was, the leader the city had been waiting for. One evening, weeks after Calloway's final court hearing, Camille found herself walking through the very courthouse where everything had started. The halls were quieter now, the echoes of that fateful day still lingering in the air. She stopped near the marble wall where he had shoved her, where he had tried to strip her of her dignity. She reached out, running her fingers over the cool stone, remembering that moment, not with anger, but with the certainty that she had won. A voice broke through the silence. Chief Harris. She turned to find Detective Marcus Reed approaching, hands in his pockets, a small, knowing smirk on his face. Heard the governor's office wants to meet with you next week. Word is, they're talking about implementing some of your policies statewide. Camille let out a quiet breath, shaking her head slightly. That so? Marcus nodded. That's so. A beat of silence passed between them, filled with something unspoken, something solid. He studied her for a moment before speaking again. You really did it. She exhaled, a small, tired smile playing at the corner of her lips. We're not done yet. Marcus chuckled, nodding. No. But it's one hell of a start. As they walked out of the courthouse together, the city stretched before them, alive, moving, changing. Camille knew that the battle for justice was never truly over. But today, she had won. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel it. Because the truth was simple. Power doesn't belong to those who abuse it. It belongs to those who refuse to surrender to it. Now, let's talk about it. How did this story make you feel? Did you expect justice to be served in the way that it was? And most importantly, what do you think this story says about power, accountability, and change? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, I want to hear what you think. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist and turn on notifications. There are so many more twists and turns to come, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thanks for listening. And remember, the story is never over.